And so I want to take a moment before we really get into what James is addressing here, and I want to address this idea of judging, right? Because there's a lot that gets thrown around about you're not supposed to judge and do not judge. And if we don't understand what judging is or what James is talking about here, we might have a kind of a skewed view of how that's to be lived out in our lives. I'm going to start by showing there seems to be a contradiction going on between James and Paul. If you remember, several weeks ago, we talked about a supposed contradiction between James and Paul, where James says that it's faith and works, and Paul seems to say in Romans that it is faith alone. And so what's the contradiction? We worked that out to show there's not a contradiction. Well, here we see James and Paul might seem to be contradicting again. And so I'm going to take a look at that, and through that help us to understand this judging issue. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 through 12, Paul is saying, he says, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people, yet I certainly did not mean the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I have written to you not to keep company with anyone named a brother who is immoral or covetous or an idolater or a reviler or a drunkard or an extortioner, not even to eat with such a person. For what have I to do with judging those also who are outside? Do you not judge those who are inside? But those who are outside, God judges, therefore put away from yourselves the evil person. There seems to be going on here. Paul is saying that we ought to be judging those in the church, right? He's saying don't judge. Whenever I said don't judge, I'm not saying the people outside, but inside. You need to be paying attention to one another and what is going on. But James is saying, hey, don't judge a brother. Uh-oh, contradiction. What's going on? Well, there's actually not a contradiction. In John chapter 7, verse 24, Jesus says, right, Jesus says, it says, do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. So there is a form of judging. I'm not going to quote it, but in Matthew 7, where Jesus talks about, judge not lest ye be judged, and don't worry about the speck in someone else's eye, take care of the plank in your own eye. What's the end of that little parable, he says? So then you will be able to help your brother with the speck in his eye. It never says don't judge. The idea of judging, to judge something is just to make a determination, right? To make a distinction, to decide whether something is right or wrong, good or bad, worthy or unworthy. It's just to determine, to reason out, make a distinction about something. We judge things all day long. Typically in our society, the word judge has that negative connotation of condemning somebody, right? You're judging, look at you, you horrible person. That's usually what is meant nowadays by judge. It's not the only use of the word judge, right? You can say, judge someone worthy, right? You've determined something about the person. And so if you look at the context is key. If you're ever trying to understand the Bible, something seems difficult, you try to look at the context. In 1 Corinthians, Paul is writing a letter to a church that is celebrating their sin. If you read that letter, there are things going on in that church that are deplorable. There's one instance where he points out there's a guy who is sleeping with his stepmom, and they're celebrating it because they understand that God is glorified in the fact that he forgives our sin. And they go, hey, more sin equals more forgiveness equals more glory for God. So let's sin it up and have a good old time, and he forgives us, and isn't God wonderful? And so they're celebrating their sin. And Paul is saying, no, don't do that. In fact, people who are doing that ought not be in the body of believers. Get right. And so in that context, judging is not, it's just saying, hey, look among yourselves. Are you following righteous and holy living that we are called to by God and by Christ? Make a determination, make a distinction in your lives and the lives around each other. Hold one another accountable is the context of what Paul is saying. But if you go back to James, what have we been talking about in James? Pride versus humility. Right? He starts out this section with conflicts. Where do conflicts come? Is it not evil desires and prideful wants from within you? And it causes warring. And it's been talking about over and over again, selfishness and pride that we act on. He's saying, no, be humble. Right? The immediate passage right before these verses in James are saying, submit to God, humble yourself. And so the context is in humility. Don't judge other people. The judgment that James is talking about is a prideful, self-righteous condemnation of others where you stand over them and declare them to be unworthy. That's the judgment James is talking about. Paul is talking about a loving holding of accountable of your brothers and sisters. And so there's no contradiction. They're actually talking about two different ways, two different ideas of what judging means.